Good morning, everyone. I want to say something before anything else, something that is the foundation of everything that follows, because what I am about to describe has a quality to it that requires the right frame to be understood correctly rather than in the way that can sometimes feel like the celebration of someone's difficulty, which is not what this is. What this is a description of something that operates without human participation, without anyone needing to do anything to make it happen. The specific and reliable process by which energy that was directed toward harm produces its own consequences in the life of the person who directed it, not because someone arranged that outcome, but because that is how energy works consistently, without exception, without requiring anyone's help to operate. Welcome. And let me tell you what I see. There is a woman who has been directing energy toward you in a way that was not in your best interest, not openly, not in the direct and visible way. That would have made what she was doing immediately apparent to anyone watching, including you, in the indirect and calculated way of someone who understood that the direct approach would not produce what she was hoping to produce, and who chose instead the approach that requires more effort, more planning, more sustained attention to the specific dimensions of your life that she was targeting with what she was doing. I want to describe what she was doing because I think you deserve to understand it in its full form, not in the alarming form of something that was working against you that you could not see, but in the practical and grounded form of energy that was being directed against your interests in whatever specific ways she had access to in the particular configuration of your shared orbit. She was working against you. In the dimension of perception, the specific and difficult dimension of how you are seen by the people whose perception of you matters to your life and your opportunities and your connections, not by lying outright, though some of what was said was not accurate, but in the more subtle way of selective presentation, of shaping what was available to be known about you in the spaces where she had influence by emphasizing certain things and leaving other things, the things that would have painted a fuller and more accurate picture, unmentioned or underemphasized or softened into something less impactful than what they actually were. This produced, in the people who were receiving her version of you, a picture that was not fully accurate, and that worked in her favor and against yours in the particular ways that inaccurate pictures do when they are the only pictures available to people who do not have the direct experience of the person being pictured to correct for the inaccuracy. I want to dwell on this for a moment because the subtlety of it is important. And I think understanding the specific mechanism of what she was doing will help you understand why it had the effect it had and why what is now happening to her is the natural and direct consequence of the specific mechanism she chose the mechanism is the management of information, not the invention of false information, not outright fabrication, but the selective curation of true information in a way that produces a false impression without requiring any single statement to be technically untrue. This is the most difficult form of working against someone, to identify and counter, because each individual element can be defended as accurate, even when the overall impression produced is deeply inaccurate and was designed to be. She chose this mechanism because it is effective and because it provides cover for the person using it from the accusation of dishonesty, even when the dishonesty is present in the design of the whole, rather than in any individual piece. But the design of the whole is now becoming visible to the people who have been living inside the impression it produced and who are now seeing enough of the individual pieces that do not fit together in the way the design intended, to recognize that the whole was managed rather than true. In the dimension of access, the specific and real dimension of who knows who and who is introduced to whom and who is mentioned in the rooms where mentioning produces opportunity and who is not, in the spaces where she had influence. She was not mentioning you. In the moments when mentioning you would have been the appropriate and natural thing to do and would have produced something for you in terms of access or opportunity or connection that her non-mentioning prevented, without you ever knowing that the mentioning had been possible and had not happened because she chose not to make it happen. In the moments when it was hers to make happen or not, the absence of something is harder to see than the presence of something. And the absence was intentional and had real effects on the specific dimensions of your life where what was absent could have been present and would have made a difference if it had been. Now, I want to tell you about the trouble she is in, because that is the other half of this message, and it is important, and it is happening right now. Without your participation or your instigation or any action on your part, that produced it. The trouble is the natural return of what was directed outward toward you coming back in the particular form that returning energy takes when what was sent out was sent with the specific intention to harm or to diminish or to prevent something good from happening for someone else by the particular means she used. What is returning to her now is happening in the same dimensions in which she directed the energy against you. In the dimension of perception, how she is being seen by the people whose perception matters is becoming less favorable to her, not through any arrangement or intervention, but through the natural process of time and of truths making their way to the surface without assistance, in the way that truths always do, when the version that was covering them has been maintained for long enough to become unsustainable. The version she was presenting of herself and of the situations she was managing, including her management of the situation involving you, is becoming visible as a version rather than as the truth to people who matter. In the specific configuration of her life, that mirrors the configuration of your life, in which she directed the energy against you. What she did to you, in terms of perception and selective presentation, is now being done to her, not by anyone who was specifically aiming for that outcome, but by the logic of what was set in motion when she made the choices she made and directed the energy she directed. In the direction she directed it, the perception of her is changing. In the spaces and among the people where it matters most to her, and the change is producing consequences. In the real and practical dimensions of her life that are proportionate to the dimensions in which she worked against yours. In the dimension of access, the same thing is happening. The doors that were available to her based on the position she had maintained through the version she was presenting are becoming less available as the version becomes less sustainable, and the people who were opening those doors begin to have access to a fuller picture of who they have been opening doors for and what has been happening in the spaces beyond what they could directly see. The access is tightening. In the same configuration that the access for you was tightened by her selective non-mentioning in the moments that mattered. This is not punishment. I want to say that clearly. Not in the sense of someone or something punishing her for what she did in the deliberate and retributive form that punishment takes when it is consciously administered. It is consequence. The natural and impersonal consequence of choices that were made about how to direct energy and what to do with influence and how to treat someone in the shared orbit of a life that produced specific effects in that life, and that produces specific effects now in hers as the natural return of what was sent out. I want to speak now about what this means for you, because I have been describing what is happening to her, and I want to bring this back to you and what you need and what is becoming available to you as the energy that was working against you returns to its source and the space it was occupying in the configuration of your life begins to clear. The first thing that is becoming available is accuracy. The perception of you in the spaces where her version of you was the dominant available picture is becoming more accurate as the version she was presenting becomes less credible, and the people who were receiving it begin to have access to or actively seek a more complete picture of who you actually are. The more complete picture is available through the direct experience of you that some of them are now seeking because the version they were receiving has produced enough inconsistencies or has been sufficiently contradicted by their own direct observations to make the more complete picture necessary for their own understanding of the situation. You are becoming more accurately seen in the spaces where you were being inaccurately seen, and that accurate seeing is already producing things that the inaccurate seeing was preventing. The second thing that is becoming available is access, the specific access that was being withheld by the non-mentioning is beginning to arrive through channels that did not previously have. The version of you that would have produced the access and that now do, because the version is being corrected, and the correction is producing the invitations and the openings and the connections that the inaccurate version was preventing. The access is opening quietly, without fanfare, in the ordinary form of a door that was previously closed, being open now, without dramatic announcement, but open in a way it was not before, and available to you in a way it was not before, for reasons that are connected to what I have been describing about the return of what was directed against you to its source. I want to give you something important now about how to hold this information, because information like this about someone who worked against you and who is now facing the consequences of what they did can be held in several ways, and the way you hold it affects what it produces in your own energy. Going forward, hold it lightly, not in the way of something heavy that you carry with you into the spaces that are now opening, and that weighs on those spaces with the residue of what happened in the time when the energy was working against you rather than for you. Hold it lightly means knowing what happened without being defined by it, knowing that someone worked against you, without organizing your future around the fact of having been worked against, which would give what she did more influence over your forward life than it deserves. After it has already had the influence it had over the time it was operating, the time of the operating is ending. Let the ending be complete by not carrying what was operating into the next chapter as a preoccupation or a vigilance that keeps you more focused on her and on what she did than on what is now opening for you. As the space clears, I want to say something else about holding it lightly. That I think is the most important part of how to move forward from a situation like this one. The person who worked against you was operating from something inside herself that has very little to do with you specifically, and everything to do with who she is and what she believes is necessary to protect what she values or to secure what she wants in a world that feels to her like a place where those things must be fought for through the particular means she chose, rather than built toward through more direct and honest effort. the choosing of the means she chose says everything about the interior landscape she was operating from and nothing about you. Other than that, you were perceived as in the way of something she wanted or as a threat to something she valued in the particular configuration of her particular fears and desires that produced the choices she made. You were not the cause of those fears and desires. You were simply in the orbit of someone who had them and who chose to act on them in the way she chose, which is fully her responsibility and fully her consequence to bear now, without any additional involvement required from you, because it is in the title. And I have been describing it in terms of consequence and return, but I want to name it clearly one more time in the direct and simple form that the title is using. The big trouble is the collapse of the version that was the infrastructure of what she was doing, the version of herself and of the situations she was managing. That made everything she was doing possible, and that is now visibly inconsistent with what is being directly observed by the people who were only receiving the version before and who are now seeing something that the version cannot accommodate. When a version collapses, everything built on it becomes unstable. The positions that depended on the version being believed become less secure. The access that was produced by the version being believed becomes less available. The influence that the version enabled becomes less operative. That is the big trouble. The version collapsing and everything built on it becoming unstable simultaneously in the natural and inevitable way that things built on versions rather than on truth eventually become unstable, because versions require maintenance and truths do not. And when the maintenance can no longer keep up with the reality that is pressing against the version from every direction simultaneously, the version gives way. It is giving way now. And as it gives way, what was underneath it all along becomes visible to everyone who was only receiving the version and who now has to reckon with the gap between the version they were given and what was actually there underneath it. That reckoning is her big trouble, and it is happening now in the lives of the people around her, whose reckoning with the gap is producing the real and practical consequences that the collapsing version and the revealing of what was underneath it always produces for the person who built on the version rather than on the truth. When the building was happening, you do not need to watch this. You do not need to monitor it or track its progress or concern yourself with the specific forms that the consequence is taking in her life. Right now, your work is not the watching. Your work is the stepping forward into the space that is clearing. and the receiving of the accuracy and the access that are becoming available as the version that was working against you gives way to what is actually true about who you are and what you carry and what you deserve from the spaces and people that the version was keeping from seeing you correctly. Step forward into the clearer space and let what is now true about how you are being seen and what is becoming available to you become the reality of your life going forward. She plotted, and the plotting is producing its own undoing without your participation, without your effort, without your attention being required for the consequence to arrive. That is how this works. Always, without exception, without the need for anyone to make it work. The energy returns to its source in the form and at the time that the source requires for the full weight of the lesson of what was directed outward and how and why to be felt. And you, in the clearing that the return creates, move forward into what was always going to be available to you. When the version that was covering it finally gave way to what was always underneath, which is the truth of who you are and what you deserve and what the world has for you. When it can see you clearly, it can see you clearly now. Move into that